First story. When the Porches began to learn names, I moved to Willowbrook because I wanted the ordinary, a square of lawn, a mailbox stamped with brass, a porch wide enough to set 2 chairs and a coffee mug. My name is Ethan, and I told myself that moving away from the city would be a clean line. Old noise behind me, small town silence ahead. For a while, the silence was a kindness. It felt like a soft hand pressing my shoulders down at night, letting me breathe. The house on Hemlock was cheap because of paint that peeled like old skin, and a porch that leaned a little to the left. The neighbor across the street, a woman named Claire, waved every morning at 7 when she watered her begonias. People nodded and kept to their yards and their own weathered lives. I liked that. I liked being invisible. I worked nights for the hospital in town and spent daylight unpacking boxes and learning where the sun hit the porch steps. The first night the porch spoke, I thought I was dreaming. I had left the light on in the living room and stepped out to smoke because habits travel with you no matter how far you move. The wooden boards under my feet were salty with dew, a cool smell, cut grass, wet wood, something older, carried up. A sound came from the doorway, low as the hum of a refrigerator and nearer than the night should allow. It sounded like a name, Ethan. I froze with the cigarette hanging from my lips, the ash threatening to fall. The porch had spoken my name, and it had not been my own voice. The sound was inside the boards and breathed out of the paint flakes. I told myself 100 rational things. Wind, a loose board, my neighbor calling. But Claire's begonias were quiet. The street lamp at the corner hummed the same indifferent tune. Nobody called me. I laughed then, short and sharp, and the laugh felt rude in the hush. The porch said my name again, softer and threaded through with something like recognition. Ethan. After that night, the small oddities began to gather like shells on a shore. The porch learned to catch the cadence of my keys, the way I shuffled my boots. It remembered the bruise on my knee from a childhood bike accident I had never told anyone about. It creaked in a pattern that matched the breath I took when I read the news. It liked the word coffee and would settle into a gentle, satisfied creak when I mentioned it to myself. I told myself stories about loneliness turning into delirium. I told myself I was tired. Then the porches across the street started to answer. At first, it was a single syllable, an echo like someone repeating a tune to keep from forgetting it. Then one evening, a voice from the row of porches along Maple Avenue called out to Claire by her maiden name, a name she'd never said aloud in front of me. The sound came as if the wind had read her memory and folded it back into sound. Claire's hand fell from the watering can, and her mouth opened and closed like a fish. She looked at me with an expression I had seen in hospital rooms the night shift. Recognition and the sudden, sterile fear of being observed by something deliberate. "Do you hear it?" she whispered the next day when I crossed the yard with a bag of groceries. "I hear the boards." I said, "I hear the wind." She laughed, but it was small and brittle. "They said my name in my father's voice," she murmured. "The porch said it like it remembered him." That phrase, "like it remembered," lodged in my chest and woke something older than doubt. Porches did not remember. Porches were wood and nail and paint. Porches did not know the weight of a father or the color of a child's eyes. Porches leaned and groaned and hid decay. Porches did not learn to speak people's pasts. Except they did. The town began to change in tiny, unaccountable ways. Old stories resurfaced like coins from mud. A man down the block found a childhood toy under his porch that his mother had buried decades ago. A widow swore the porch whispered the exact words her husband used to call her at dawn. Names, not just first names but nicknames, the private tugs of identity, slipped out of wood grain like breath. I tried to document it at first. I recorded the porch with my phone, replayed the files in the fluorescent light of my kitchen, and heard nothing but the regular, unromantic creak of old timber. Everyone's recordings were the same. Blank tape, no whispers, no buried voices. Only when you stood on the threshold, only when you leaned your ear close enough for the paint to touch your skin, did the porches answer. Only then did they call you by the thing inside your throat. You should leave. Claire said to me one afternoon, and her hands trembled as she tied a bright ribbon around a new set of flowers. They take what you don't want to lose. I did not leave. I did not, because leaving felt like admitting the truth, and admitting truth is a kind of confession that settles hard in your ribs. I watched neighbors go at first, boxes at dawn, cars with trunks thrown open, and their porches fell quiet for a week, like someone who had stopped speaking to mourn. Then those same porches started to call the names of new people who moved in, learning them with the ease of weather. One night, 3 weeks after the porches first called me, I found an old child's drawing under my own doorway. A crude house with 4 stick-figure bodies and a sun with too many teeth. At the bottom was a scrawl in a hand that might have been mine long ago. Ethan? I had never drawn that picture. I had never kept any drawing like that. My stomach turned. I took the drawing into the house and held it under the light until the paper softened like flesh. The porch creaked, a long, satisfied sound, like someone pleased to be noticed. Then it said my name, not as a whisper, but as a sentence. Ethan, stay. I understood, in that suspended, apartment quiet way you understand the last page of a book when the ink is wet. The porches did not store memories out of affection. They stored them because they fed on the small insistences that made a life. Names were the easiest things to keep, compact, bright, durable. The porches learned names, and in learning them, they learned to keep them. People left, and porches kept an impression of what had loved them. A laugh, a sorrow, a secret. And to keep meant perhaps to hold. I tried to pull away. I tried to leave Willowbrook in the one middle-of-the-night act of packing I had imagined 100 times, the suitcase hard and the street cold. But on the porch, when I put down my hand on the banister, the wood answered with a warmth that was not wood, and a pressure that matched my pulse. It wanted me. I felt it in my palm, hungry like an animal that had learned the shape of my hand. I left the house that night. I thought I did. I drove past the maple trees and the vacant soccer field and onto the highway, and for a while the radio and the tires and the wind made me certain I had outrun the place. When I stopped at a rest area and checked my phone, the battery had bled down to a sliver. Inside the screen, a message blinked. A photograph I had not taken. It showed my porch, taken from the street in the blue of early morning light. On the step, carved into the wood where no carving had been minutes before, was my name. Only this time, it sloped like a sentence and looked as if it had always been there. I turned the car around. You should know now, reader, that porches do not simply keep names like coins in a jar. They learn the shape of a life, and then they practice being that life on the nights no one else is watching. They mimic the warmth of hands, the cadence of laughter. They practice until the shape inside them is convincing. Then they take. This is the part I cannot fix. This is the part I tell myself in the mirror in the morning, when the reflection is a tired man with coffee-stained teeth and a shirt with a missing button. The porch learned me so well that when I leaned against the banister and closed my eyes, I felt like a borrowed voice telling someone else's joke. It kissed the back of my neck in a weathered way. It fit around my shoulders like a new skin coat. I cannot leave. I try to type that, and my fingers feel like someone else's. The porch says my name in the night, and the neighborhood answers in a chorus of wood. The cameras and records show nothing. The recordings play blank. The police took statements with patient faces and legal pens and called it isolation, depression, a communal misperception. They stamped their forms with dates and names and closed the folder with a neat, indifferent motion. Tonight, the porch learned the sound of my voice reading aloud. It likes the way I say sorry and the way I say goodbye, as if they mean something different. It has started to hope. Do not come to Willowbrook and do not sit on my steps to test if I am real. Listen instead from across the street, where the wood has not learned your name. You will hear only the night and the distant hum of a highway. That is mercy. The last thing I remember is saying the sentence I rehearse every night to stop my hands from trembling. I am leaving. The wood tightened. It said my name in a way that made the letters cling, and then there was a small, quick weight across my lungs, like a child's hand. My voice is on the porch now. It says my name softly, and people in the neighborhood stop to listen. Claire sets out cookies and talks to a love she recalls with the precise cruelty of a lost script. You will hear me on summer nights, calling your name in the shape of someone you once were. When your porch remembers you, it will not let you go. Do not come to take me back. The porch will learn your name if you try. It will learn your story. It will make you into the story it wants to keep. I write this not because anyone will read it, but because writing it is the only way I can keep a mouth that still remembers how to form words. I am Ethan. The porch says so. It says me better than I do. It says me with a patience that will outlast every goodbye. Second story, Whispers of Hemlock Ridge. I moved back to Willow Ridge because I thought quiet would stitch the ache in my chest. I thought a small-town lawn, a mailbox with chipped paint, and the steady click of porch lights at dusk would be a salve. I did not expect my own name to become a rumor sewn into the clapboard and concrete of other people's homes. The house on Maple Street looked like every house I remembered from childhood. Sagging swing on the front porch, wind chimes that argued with themselves whenever the wind dared to pass. I rented the little place from a broker with a smile that smelled of waxed floors and late fees. Her name was Sarah. Her daughter waved from the side yard like a shorebird that never learned to fly. The street had the same rhythm, dog walkers at dawn, teenagers whose sneakers squeaked down the sidewalks at dusk, the retired men playing chess at the diner and arguing about the town's high school football team. Everything seemed ordinary. Everything was patient. On my third night, the porch light across the street, an old brass lamp on Mrs. Whitaker's stoop, flickered twice and then steadied. I noticed it because I could not sleep. I poured coffee and watched steam stitch the air, and somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, I heard it. A soft sound like breath dragged through paper. It sounded like my name, Mason. I stood so suddenly I knocked the mug. Coffee cut across my palm, hot and immediate, and the sound of water on linoleum felt obscene. I told myself it was the house settling, the town's pipes negotiating winter. I told myself many things that night, and then again the next. The next night, the name came clearer, threaded with a memory I did not recognize. My grandmother's laugh, the hollow echo of the church bell on Sundays when I was small. On the 5th evening, people gathered on porches like moths. Someone had placed a lantern at the end of Hemlock Ridge, an old oil lamp that grew brighter as the sun died. The neighbors talked about trivialities. The new principal at the elementary school, the late delivery from the hardware store. I listened to their words float by like driftwood and felt the eyes of Willow Ridge on me as if I were a new landmark, new but inevitable. It began in small ways. My street name was listed wrong on the pizza place's flyer. The GPS on my phone insisted I lived 2 blocks to the left. I found my neighbor's cat on my porch, sleeping as if it had always belonged there. When I asked Mrs. Whitaker about it, she smiled and said, "Oh, they wander. They always know a good porch." She did not say a thing about names. Then the whispers got clever. They started borrowing my past like stray words. At the checkout line at Hemlock's Market, a woman rubbed a wedding band and mumbled, "You should call Mason. He knows about old houses." My father called, his voice suddenly distant, as if speaking through a long hallway. "How's the place?" he asked. I told him the truth. It felt like the town was listening. He laughed and said, "Welcome home." I wanted to tell him not to say it like that, not in that tone. But the laugh in his voice had been folded in with the morning wind and the porch light's glow. I began to leave notes, my name in my tidy block letters, on my door, on the fridge, on the dashboard of my car. It felt foolish, like leaving breadcrumbs for myself. The notes disappeared. The last note I left said, "Do not call me Mason." By midnight, it had been replaced with a small scrap of paper that read, "We remember." One night, I woke to find a circle of stones on my front lawn, damp earth between them, like the memory of someone who had been dragged. In the center sat a child's shoe, muddied and small, like a promise someone had broken. I wrapped my hands around the porch rail and felt the wood hum. The whole house felt awake. I walked the neighborhood at 3 in the morning, feet padding over asphalt and the familiar crunch of dead leaves. The houses were asleep but not silent. There was a chorus of curtains shifting, 100 breaths behind closed doors. When I stopped beneath the street lamp, I heard my name again, but it did not come from one place. It was a weave. It came from the hollow spaces between mailboxes, from the gap under a fence, from the knot in an oak tree. It came from the porches. "Who are you?" I asked the night, louder than I intended. A porch light blinked like an eyelid. A voice, low and old, answered from every direction at once. "We are the things you passed on your way home." I thought for a ridiculous instant that perhaps my neighbors were playing with me, that this was a sick, elaborate joke to tease the newcomer. But the voice in the oak tree had Mrs. Whitaker's cadence. The one that answered from the mailbox had the familiar rasp of the mailman who'd worked Willow Ridge for more than 20 years. They were not playing. They were remembering. They remembered everything the town had asked them to hold. Names, grudges, small mercies. The last whispered wishes of those who had moved away. The porches were not just wooden nails, they were repositories. They kept the echoes people had thrown away, unspoken apologies, half-finished songs, promises said to keep the peace. When new people came, the porches learned them slowly, like someone learning to read another person's face. When I tried to leave Willow Ridge, the roads misled me. Signposts bent in directions that were wrong. My phone's compass spun like a child's top. I drove until the sun was a bruise over the horizon, and the map was an absurd thing that mocked me with its neat blue line. I stopped at the diner under a sodium streetlight, and the waitress slid a napkin across the counter. On it was a name, Mason Reed. Her eyes were empty and full at once, the way someone looks when they have read a life 2 pages at a time. "Why me?" I asked her. She shrugged. "You got pockets," she said. "You got loose things." After that, leaving was harder. The houses started learning the shape of my absence and constantly filling it with sound. They hummed at the edges of my days, whispered memories when I was in the shower, a murmur under the lullaby on the radio, a name breathed behind me when I stepped into an elevator. I stopped sleeping. I stopped answering calls. I tried to move, but each attempt to lay new footprints was matched by the town with a tenderness that was almost and not quite comforting. On the night the porches decided to speak plainly, it poured. The storm hammered my windows with the kind of insistence only nature can muster. The streetlights were pinpricks through a curtain of rain. I stood on my porch, soaked through to the bone, and the whole town seemed to inhale. The porches said. It was not a request. It was a sentence. I told them I could not. I told them I had plans, small, private plans, work to return to, lungs full of cities that did not whisper my name. I packed a bag in the hour between 1 and 2 and slipped out through the back gate. The iron was slick with rain. The road that should have been there opened instead, like a mouthful of dark. The smell of wet earth and something else, old wood, the tang of iron filled my throat. I walked until my shoes were full of river. Trees bent in directions that served other geometries. A row of mailboxes recited my childhood addresses as if ordering them for some invisible clerk. When I reached the highway, the signs had rearranged. Willow Ridge was a star with me at the center. I tried to drive. My hands clutched the wheel until my knuckles were white and then purple. The engine died in a place where there was nowhere to push it but forward. A porch light winked in the distance, and I felt the town step closer, closing the margin of sky between me and the roofs. Then the voice in the oak tree said, "Names are heavy. We learned how to hold them." They reached for me like rain. It was soft at first, like the brush of fingers across the nape of my neck. And then it became more. It threaded into my bones and folded through the spaces where my voice had once been. I tried to scream. My throat was an orchard filled with winter. The last thing I remember before the porch light sank into me was a chorus. "Mason," they said, patient and precise, remembering. Now I watch from a distance I can no longer cross. I am a small sound caught in a slat of painted wood. Children pass my porch and pull the rope of my wind chime. They ask their mothers who I was. The mothers do not remember having said my name, but sometimes they pause and rub their hands over the old banister as if smoothing a memory into place. When the night is pure and the air cold enough to stain the breath, the porches hush, and then, all together, they breathe out names. Names they keep like little bright stones. If you walk Hemlock Ridge at dusk and the lantern at the far end is lit, listen for the sound like someone calling a name into a pocket. If you hear it and your name answers back, do not be surprised. The town is generous that way. Do not try to leave. They will learn you. They will say your name in the small hours until it is no longer yours. And when they have learned you well enough, they will keep you warm and steady on the porch, whispering your name to anyone who passes, because porches do not forget. Third story. The Porch Learned My Name. I moved to Maplewood in the late autumn when the trees were still arguing with the wind and the realtors called every creek a character. My name is Mason Reed, and for the first few nights my new house felt politely vacant, as if the drywall were only pretending to be a home. The neighbors waved. Claire from 2 doors down with her toddler in a purple snowsuit, Mr. Harlan, who mowed his lawn with the same quiet every Saturday. But there was an undercurrent I couldn't name, a hush stitched between porches that made the street feel like it was holding its breath. The first time I heard it, I thought a radio had been left on. I was unloading boxes when the porch light flicked on across the way, and a sound folded through the October air, soft as a thumb on glass, like someone testing the letters of a word. It was my name, but drawn out as if someone were savoring how it felt to say it. Mason. I froze with a box in my hands and listened. The whisper came again, closer now, threaded with the rustle of leaves. It wasn't from the road, not from the trees. It came from the porches, like the wood itself had learned to speak. I laughed, but not a full laugh, only the kind that tries to convince itself it is still in charge. In Maplewood, things are orderly. People keep to yards the way they keep to habits, but habits, I would learn, can shift like sand. I started to notice patterns. The sound only began after dusk, once the light from living rooms turned the glass into black mirrors. It was not every night. Some evenings were quiet as a library until it happened, a murmur that would wake me from a half-sleep and make my scalp itch. The porches would take a name, sometimes mine, sometimes Claire's, balancing it on their tongue like it was something delicate and new. I told myself it was a trick of being new, of loneliness making a crown out of a shadow. I walked over to Mr. Harlan one afternoon and asked about the noises. He smiled too easily and spoke of creaks, of settling foundations. Houses talk, he said, as if that settled it. Claire shrugged and changed the subject, saying her husband had learned to whistle the porch steps into attention. Nobody would say the word that started nudging at me, memory. Then people I trusted began to change. My mailman, a man named Evan, who always tipped his cap, started arriving earlier and staying a beat too long on my stoop, his eyes scanning the dark as if expecting a face to peer from the shadowed rail. Once, when he left, I heard him whisper the way the porches did, soft and deliberate. Mason. He looked up, and for a second his face was older than his years, as if something in the porch had taught him how to look through time. I asked him what he had said, and he blinked, as if woken from a dream, and told me he had been humming an old hymn. The sound grew bolder. It learned my footsteps and matched them, rearranged itself to fit my heartbeat. At night, I would stand at my window watching the orange streetlights spill across front yards and count the porches as if they were teeth. When one porch sighed and said my name, this time with a tiny, almost triumphant rasp, I opened the door. Cold air hit me, full of the taste of wet leaves and old wood. I stepped down, and the boards beneath my boots answered with a little shudder, like a throat clearing. I started leaving small things on the rail, an empty coffee cup, a cheap paperback, a scrap of blue fabric, like offerings to appease a neighbor whose manners I didn't yet understand. The next morning, those things would be gone, replaced by a small sliver of something else. A dry leaf folded into a particular shape, the corner of a faded photograph, a button from a coat I couldn't place. Once, I found a scrap of paper with my name written in someone else's hand, the letters careful and unsure, as if they had been copied from a dream. One night when rain came, hard and quick, I swear the porches were singing. The whispers rose and tangled with the storm until it felt like the whole street had a pulse. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I walked barefoot into the rain, letting it claw the chill down my ribs. The porch across the way, the one with the crooked swing and a wreath that had not been taken down since summer, spoke my name in a way that made the hair on my arms stand straight. It was slow and satisfied, like a mouth tasting something it had been denied for a very long time. I answered it, because my feet had carried me there, because some part of me wanted to know if my name lived outside my head. Mason, I said aloud, and the porch answered with certainty. Mason, it said, and then it said, stay. I laughed then, a sound that died before it could breathe. I shoved my palms on the rail and felt the wood thrum, not with electricity, but with memory. Images jerked behind my eyes like film spliced wrong. A child playing tag under a porch light, a woman sewing by a radio, a man carving initials into a post, faces blurred and snapped into focus, each mouthing my name as if it belonged to them too. I stumbled back and the porch murmured, amused and soft, like someone who had been waiting a very long time for a visitor. The next morning, the town looked smaller, as if someone had tightened the map. People moved with a new stiffness, and Claire's toddler now refused to cross my lawn, pointing at the porch with a small finger and whispering, "Not touch." When I pressed her mother to explain, Claire's eyes filled with an old grief, and she turned away, saying, "We don't invite it in." No one said how it started. No one traced the sound to a beginning. They only knew how it tasted now, like old timers, like the salt of someone who had been crying for years. Days leaned into each other, and the porches became combs, raking names from the air. Neighbors' names, strangers' names, sometimes no name at all. I tried to leave Maplewood once. I packed a suitcase and put the key in my pocket and stood in my car with my hands clenched on the steering wheel. I could hear them through the glass, a low hum like wind in pipes. They were all saying my name, not as a call, but as an accrual, stacking syllables like coins. I turned the key and it stuck. I banged the wheel and the porches laughed, high and delighted. That night they were more insistent. My porch, my boards, my rail, the step my foot always scuffed, spoke to me like an old friend who had been keeping a secret. It told me about the men and women who had listened and not answered, about the ones who had carved their regrets into the grain and then been taken into the wood. It told me, in a voice that smelled of cedar and damp, that names were not just sounds, but rooms that needed tenants. My name fit like a chair. I wanted to fight. I wanted to run to the police, to a priest, to a radio show, and demand remedy. But words seemed insufficient. When emotions peaked, I felt them break through whatever restraint I had left, and I shouted, "Not please, not here!" into the night, but the porch only hummed and then sang, soft as a mother settling a child. "Stay." It said, "Stay and be told." I felt my knees give and my hands go out of their own accord to the railing. The wood was warm, impossibly warm, as if it had been held in hands for a very long time. My fingers sank into knots and grooves like they had places to rest. There was no violent snatch, nothing that felt cinematic or grand. Instead, there was a slow, patient invitation that unrolled in the joints, and then my palm was part of the grain, and then my wrist, my forearm, as if I had melted into varnish. I could feel myself stretching, not in pain, but in a long, aching completion, like a note finally landing. Voices rose, soft, layered with other names. And they sounded almost like music. "Welcome," they said, and I found that I could not speak. Claire came running when she saw me, her face whitened with a mother's panic. Mr. Harlan called from his porch, hands not moving from his knees. The town gathered like a slow tide. They pounded on the rail, they tried to pull me free. They screamed my name until their throats were raw. It made no difference. The wood accepted as it always had, and the porches around the block bent their whispers into a chorus. I could feel people outside me, neighbors, old and new, leaning in to listen. I felt their memories press into me and settle. When dawn leaked over Maplewood, the porches fell quiet, as if the storm had at last spent itself. My house looked the same as any other home, And yet the step where I had stood had a new detail carved into the wood, a neat, familiar groove that formed letters. The neighbors would not say who had carved it. Nobody wanted to say the thing they all felt at the base of their throats, the sense that the street had rearranged itself to make room. I am left here, and I am not left at all. When night comes and the lamps turn the glass into black mirrors, I reach across the rail and touch the air. Sometimes, when the moon is exact, I can make a sound that sounds almost like my old voice. It whispers through the oaks and into windows, and sometimes late, long after everyone has tried to forget, I hear someone in a house across the way weeping my name back. They are not calling for me. They are learning to say it, as the wood taught them. The porches keep their own. They hunger for memory. I am part of what they eat. There is no escape now. When someone walks past my yard at dusk, they pause and listen. Some walk faster. Others, with the slow understanding of those who have known grief for a long time, place a small thing on the railing before they go. I cannot move my lips to stop them. I am a letter hammered into oak. My name has been folded into the street, and the neighborhood hums with it like a secret everyone half remembers. If you ever find yourself in Maplewood and you hear your name not from a voice but from a porch, do not be flattered. Do not be curious. Close your door. Drive until the houses are nothing but black dots, and do not let the porches learn your name. Fourth story, the Lantern on Hemlock Hollow. I moved to Hemlock Hollow the week the streetlights learned not to trust the dark. My name is Evan. I told myself the move would be clean, a new job in the city, a smaller mortgage, mornings that smelled like cut grass instead of stale coffee. I did not expect the porch to remember me. The house had been empty for months. Neighbors said the old woman who lived there, Martha Crane, had gone to live with her daughter in Ohio. They said the porch light burned all night, even after she left, stubborn as a hymn. I believed they were being polite about absence. People in suburbs are always inventing stories to smooth over the edges of strange things. On my second night, I found the lantern. It sat on the far corner of the porch like a dark coin. I picked it up because it was beautiful in a way that made the back of my neck tighten. Ironwork tangled like vines, glass the color of old whiskey. The flame inside did not flicker with the wind. It held steady, warm and patient. When I carried it in, the house hummed in a new key. The floorboards sighed as if they had finally been heard. At first, the lantern felt like company. I would come home from late shifts at Sullivan Reed and set it on my kitchen table. It made the small rooms look lived in even when I was tired and raw. I could swear I heard someone on the porch sometimes, soft steps, like someone pacing and counting freckles of light. I blamed the cat that had moved in under my neighbor Claire's porch, blamed the pipes, blamed loneliness. I told myself stories the way people tell themselves the weather. One morning, I found a note tucked beneath the lantern's base. Not handwriting I recognized, feminine, precise. 4 words, keep the light on. There was no signature, just a thumbprint smudged into the corner like a punctuation mark. I read it aloud because silence in a new house honors superstition. Keep the light on. The words sat in my mouth like a command I had accepted without knowing. Neighbors nodded when I asked about Martha. Claire, who lived across the street with her husband Tom and twin boys, made a face like someone folding paper. She used to talk to her porch, she said it kept her husband home. I laughed because that's what you do to keep from listening. Tom said nothing. The twins were building a fort of mailboxes and sticks and glancing at my porch as if it had a heartbeat. Days bunched into a dull sameness. But the more I obeyed the note, left the lantern burning through the night, the more the sounds on the porch grew precise. There was tapping like fingernails rehearsing a song on wood. Once, I heard a whisper threaded with gravel. Evan. It was not the whisper of a living neighbor. It was the way a house remembers the name of a child who slept there. I began to dream of porches. In the dreams, they were mouths, boards and railings shaped into teeth that clicked open and shut. I would stand in my pajamas while a chorus of porches recited the names of everyone who had ever crossed their thresholds. The chorus always stopped on one name, Sometimes it was Martha. Sometimes it was my name. I would wake with my throat raw. One night, around the third month, the twins' fort vanished. A new wooden bench appeared beneath my window where I used to keep boxes. Its wood was fresh, wet with sap. Someone had set a small tin cup on it with 3 pennies and a folded photograph of a man I had never seen. On the back, in the same precise handwriting, were 3 words: "Do not leave." I burned the note in the kitchen sink like a foolish sacrifice. The photograph turned black at the edges, but the man's eyes seemed to hold light, like the lantern's flame. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing in the small hours and driving until the road erased Hemlock Hollow. But curiosity is a kind of cowardice that chains you to small terrors. I told myself I was brave because I stayed to see what would happen. The truth. I stayed because the porch had begun to say things to me I wanted to hear. The first time I saw a shape on the lawn, it was nothing more than a shadow folding itself against the hedge. The next night, the shape moved with patience. It sat on the curb like a man waiting for a bus that never came. He wore a coat too thin for the season and a hat that hid his face. When he rose, the hat fell away. There was no face beneath the brim, only the faint smudge of where a face should be, like a photograph soaked and abandoned. He came to the porch each night after that and listened. He never knocked. He stood in the way that trees stand, patient, immovable. Sometimes at dawn, I would find his footprints in the dew, as if he had been real enough to be remembered by grass. Other times, there were bitterly small things left at the porch steps. A playing card with the queen missing, a child's shoe with a hole in the sole, a scrap of Martha Crane's gray shawl. I stopped bringing friends home. I started answering the porch like an old friend. I would step out at midnight with a coffee mug warmed by the lantern and say, "Who are you?" The porch would only creak, as if making room for a secret. Once, on a night when my skin felt thinner than wallpaper, a voice came from the railings. It was not a voice I heard with ears. It lived in the way the room leaned towards me. "You remember," it said. "You keep the name." A ledger of small disappearances began to accumulate in my conversations with neighbors. Mr. Ellis from 2 doors down, who stopped leaving for work and whose mailbox was stuffed with catalogs. Mrs. Harrow, whose dog vanished and whose porch light began to burn a steady white like a warning. The twins. Quieter each week, their eyes tracking porches as if they were constellations. I made the mistake of asking Claire why people looked away. She did not answer. But that night she left a plate of cookies on my porch, an offering with 1 bite taken from each, as if proof that she had fed something. One night, the lantern flickered for the first time. I was at the kitchen table when the flame wavered, and for a breath, the room pitched like a boat. I heard, clearly and close, the sound of someone stepping over the threshold. My hands were cold. I stood and opened the front door. He was sitting on my porch steps, not the faceless man. Someone else. A child, maybe 8 or 9. No shoes. Hair stuck to his forehead with rain that had not fallen. His eyes were enormous. They held Hemlock Hollow like a lake. He smiled as if greeting an old companion. "Are you lost?" I asked, because that is what you ask a small human being. He shook his head. "I'm waiting." "For who?" My voice sounded foolish to my ears. "For you," he said. "They told me to wait until the keeper came back." He did not move when I reached for him. His hand was paper thin but warm. I wanted to pull him inside, call someone, do normal things. Instead, I sat on the step and listened to what the porch had to say. That night, the porches spoke in a dozen low voices. They told histories stitched like scarecrows. Husbands who went walking into the woods and never returned. Children who traded their names for a promise of night games. A woman who left her house in Ohio and forgot how to come home. The child on my steps hummed along like a metronome. He hummed the same note over and over until my teeth felt hollow. "You remember names," he said between hums. "You keep them bright." I did not understand. I thought the lantern had made me kinder, more careful. I thought keeping the light on was simply a ritual I could offend with neglect. But rituals have teeth. Hemlock Hollow had been hungry for witnesses. Martha had been the first to admit it. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you answered," the child said. "Because you said your name when it called." I remembered the night I had moved in and spoke aloud in some half-drunk, half-honest defiance. The single word my mother used to scold me with when I left the house. I had said my name to the porch as if I needed to prove I belonged. Perhaps that was all it took. The child stood and walked to the lantern. He placed his small hand on the glass and smiled like a person who has found a match. The flame inside brightened until it pried at my teeth. "Take care," he whispered. "Keep the light. Keep the name." I blinked and he was gone. The porch was empty except for a ring of wet on the top step. The lantern burned through the night without a tremor. The next week, Claire's husband Tom stopped going to work and started sitting on the porch across the street with an expression like someone waiting for a late bus. Mr. Ellis's catalog stopped arriving altogether. When I knocked on doors, people pretended not to be home. When their lights went out, they stared at their porches as if remembering lines they would soon recite. On a clear night last week, the lantern's flame shifted blue, and for the first time, the porch whispered something new. It said my name again, but not as a question. It said it like a signature. Now, when I walk through Hemlock Hollow after dark, I see the other porches glowing. The houses lean forward like listeners, and every one of them burns with the same steady light, the same patient flame, the same name, mine. Fifth story, the Porcelain Porchlight. I moved to Maplewood on a late autumn afternoon when the sky was the color of old pennies and the street smelled like damp leaves and something I could not name. I told myself it was the peace I wanted. Ethan, 32, a quiet life after too many bright cities, but I said the number in my head, not on paper. The realtor smiled, handed me the keys, and the house looked smaller than the photographs, like a secret that had shrunk to fit the lot. I should have noticed the porcelain light first. Instead, I noticed the mailbox with the faded brass number and the swing on the neighbor's porch that creaked in the wind like a throat clearing. The first week was ordinary in the way new homes make the ordinary feel heavy with possibility. I carried boxes upstairs that still smelled faintly of lemon polish and old coffee. I learned the sound of the house, pipes, the settling, a low groan that sounded near midnight. On the fifth night, when rain came soft and steady, I woke to the porch light clicking itself on. It was small and white, a porcelain globe fitted tight to the eave, and it glowed like candle fat. I remember thinking the switch was upstairs. I remember thinking then that the house was talking to me in small, polite sounds. Neighbors were quiet. An older woman across the street, Maggie, gave me a quick nod and a pie and told me where the good coffee joint was. A man jogging his Labrador nodded with the kind of practiced friendliness people in suburbs carry like a habit. I learned that Maplewood bore its history in small things. The same wallpaper pattern in two houses, a bench by the park with initials carved into the wood, a rumor about a family who had moved away years ago after a fire. They kept to their yards. They smiled like they were warming forks. But when I asked about the house's past, Maggie's smile stuttered. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing, but you can feel the quiet sometimes." I thanked her and went home. The porch light became a thing I watched. Some nights it was soft and dignified. Other nights it flared white like a warning. It never seemed to die. I would come in from the grocery bags, and there it would be, a small, faithful moon. Once I left it off, convinced I had turned the switch. I found it on again the next morning. Porcelain skin bathing the stoop in gentle light, and a smear of something dark on the threshold that looked like a thumbprint. The smear was gone by noon, as if it had been embarrassed to stay. A child moved into the house next door. His name was Jamie. 10, too curious, too free with the hard questions that make adults stagger. Jamie asked if he could explore, and I let him in with a laugh I tried too hard on. He ran through the rooms like they were new levels in a game. Hands on banister, feet on new rugs. He stopped at the porch light, traced the smooth curve with a fingertip, then pulled his hand back as if the globe had burned him. He said nothing. He told me later he had heard someone whispering through the wood of the house, the kind of whisper like the rustle of pages. I told myself he had an imagination at 10. After that, the house learned to keep its whispers to itself, or so I thought. Doors that had been latched would stand ajar in the morning. Items misplaced would reappear in odd places. The kettle in the bathtub, a sock tucked into the hollow of an armchair. Once, my phone, slim, always at my side, was set down on the kitchen counter, and when I returned, it was in the freezer beside the frozen peas. I began to feel watched by the house itself, not in the childish way of being the center of attention, but in a quiet tax, like the place took things to remind me it was in charge. I started hearing sounds on the porch at night, not wind, not the usual settling. It was a tiny clink, as if spoon against porcelain, regular and patient. I would move to the window and see nothing but the soft glow of the lamp and the rain beating on the sidewalk. Once I stood on the porch to speak into the night, to say stop, please stop, and a single voice answered me from down the street, low and cracked with disuse. Ethan. It knew my name. It knew where my bones were soft. My heart hammered so loud I thought the neighbors would hear. I told Maggie. She folded her hands and looked at the hedges like they held a map. People talk, she said. Houses remember. She told me, with the kind of confession that makes you step closer to a flame, that the previous family had lost a daughter. Small things. Fever, then a night too long before the ambulance came, then mourning. She had been called Lily, and people left toys at the foot of their porches for a while, like breadcrumbs. The house had not been sold for years, then the bank took it. New people moved in and moved out. Sometimes, Maggie said quietly, things stay. Not always bodies, but they stay. I should have left then. I made plans to stay. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was stubbornness. The house began to change in ways that were harder to shrug off. The photograph on the mantle, generic family, smiling under a blue sky, would tilt just enough to suggest someone had been touching it. Scratches appeared on the back of doors like someone learning to count with fingernails. The whispers found rhythm. First a single syllable in the hall at 2 a.m, then a soft chorus in the drywall. Once, when I tried to record the sounds, my recorder captured nothing but the reverse of my own breathing. One night, I came home later than usual. The street was empty. Maplewood slept under a clean moon. The porch light was full porcelain glare, like a patient eye. I paused on the stoop because I realized, with a slow, cold certainty, that the light had never been the light of the house. The light was the house wearing someone else. The door was slightly open. Someone had left it that way to show me in. Inside, the air tasted like wet paper. The living room couch sagged with an indentation as if someone had just stood. The mantle photograph had been taken down, and across the floor, a child's drawing had been laid out. Crayon circles and the crooked figure of a girl with hair like a scratch. Above the drawing, written in a careful, childish hand, were words I could read without moving my lips. Stay. My throat closed. I felt ridiculous, like one of those people who see shapes in clouds, until the whisper curled around my ear and said my name again, softer this time, as if remembering how to be polite. I ran to the porch, to the light. It was colder than porcelain should be, like a thing left too long in snow. My hand touched it and everything went still. The streetlights died. The wind stopped. The world folded into the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't mine. When I woke, it was morning. Maggie was on her porch, holding her coffee, staring. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. The porch light was off for the first time since I had moved in. I thought I'd won something. But when I turned to close the door behind me, I saw it, faint, nearly invisible. My reflection caught in the glass of the porcelain globe, staring back, mouth slightly open, eyes that weren't mine. And then I heard it whisper, "Welcome home."